Welcome to the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burris, and our guests tonight are Karen Cheek Lomax, Esquire, and Executive Director of My Sister's Place, and Mayo Bartlett, Esquire, Defense Attorney. Ladies, gentlemen, could you please tell the audience a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Well, thanks for having me here, Mel. As you said, I'm the Executive Director of My Sister's Place. I have served in that role for approximately 4 years, and for those of you who don't know, My Sister's Place is Westchester's largest domestic violence services agency, serving victims of domestic abuse, providing counseling, supportive services, legal services, with special emphasis on immigration. We have 2 residential shelters that are confidential, and we provide just a whole host of services that help women really begin to turn their lives around and support economic independence. Mm-hmm. Prior to coming to My Sister's Place, I worked at Harlem Legal Services in New York City, providing legal programming for domestic violence victims in our family law unit.
Okay. Counselor.
Thank you for having me as well, Mel. My name is Mayo Bartlett. I'm an attorney. I am currently a defense attorney. However, I was with the Westchester County District Attorney's Office for 11 years prior to starting my private practice. I'm entering my 7th year in my private practice now, and I have to say that I've had the pleasure of working very closely with Karen and My Sister's Place in both capacities, as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney. Mm-hmm. And I can say that I believe that they are absolutely the best at what they do, and they're working in an area that's extremely complex, where you really do have to be very dedicated and very sensitive to an ever-changing world.
Okay, good. Well, let's get started on the topic. Is domestic violence on the increase?
You know, I can answer that question 2 ways. Mm-hmm. I think yes. I think that we're starting to hear more cases reported. As we begin to do more outreach and education in the communities, people begin to realize, you know what, this is me. You know, My Sister's Place in 2008, 2009, and continuing this year into 2010, did a public service campaign, did a public service announcement campaign where we had flyers and posters on the backs of B-Line buses throughout Westchester County. And what we heard from the public was, we didn't think that pertained to us. We had people that looked like people from all communities. You couldn't tell, you know, whether they were rich or poor. I mean, they were women of color that were posted. But we got a response, you know what, that let us know that we could get help, and the PSA campaign really talked to that. This year, LexisNexis has been our corporate sponsor, supporting yet another campaign that will be on the buses as well as the Metro North interior trains and on the stations. Again, really saying to people, this can be you, and there are supports out there. And as we continue through Domestic Violence Awareness Month, October is that, you know, we're hearing from more and more women that say, you know what, I can do this now because I've talked to your staff, I've talked to your lawyers, I realize that there is hope and there is a way, you know, to get out. We also see with the downturn in the economy, the numbers of requests for support, requests for lawyers, or requests for counseling have gone up. Mm-hmm. In fact, I would say over the last year, you know, because I kind of look at these statistics, my staff are telling me that those numbers have risen almost 16 to 20%, depending on what department it is, where last year this time we had 20% less requests for services. So we're seeing that either people are now reaching out, mm-hmm. And you know, I also think that the educational piece is working as well, as people begin to say, I need help.
Okay. How long has My Sister's Place been in existence?
You know, we started off in Yonkers as 32 years ago, almost 33 years ago.
Okay.
And you know, the organization began in the almost like the living rooms of women who didn't have language the language that we now have, or the laws that I think Mayo is so familiar with, to kind of talk about this issue, you know, and at that time, it wasn't called domestic abuse, it wasn't called domestic violence, it was some horrific act that had been perpetrated against a woman. And I say women because the predominant group at that time, and continuing, has been against women. We know that it happens to men, we know that it happens in same-sex relationships, but the predominant number of women, people that are abused are in fact women. And so, you know, they kind of came together and they said, we have to change this. And at that time, My Sister's Place was born through the Yonkers Women's Task Force.
Okay. Kind of give us an overview of when you get a client in. Do they come to you, or is it some way that you kind of harvest or review or contact with the DA's office or the police department? How do your clients come to you?
In all different ways. We have a hotline, we have a 24-hour hotline, so at any point you can call in. The telephone number is 914-298-SAFE, SAFE. So that's the direct number to our hotline, and that is answered 24 hours a day. So you may be able to come through that way, and you will talk to a trained counselor who will then take your case and refer it to the appropriate department. So it may be that you need legal advice around an order of protection. You may think you want to apply for an order of protection, but you don't really know. And one of the things I think is important to stress, Mel, is that we really give people options. So when you call us, we kind of give you the choices or the options, and we really allow you to decide what it is that you want. And why do we do that? Because it's really important from a safety perspective. But to kind of get back to your original question, we may see you in court. You may see us in court. We have an attorney in the Integrated Domestic Violence Court, one of our senior supervising attorneys, who's in that court, who's sitting with the judge in that court, and we get cases in that way from a legal perspective. We do a lot of outreach and education. We work with law firms all throughout New York City, and we train those lawyers, and they pick up cases, but they also refer cases to us as well. We have an office in Yonkers, we have an office in White Plains, we have a satellite office in Mount Vernon, and then we have 2 residential shelters. So at any point, depending on where the referral comes from or through a friend, we have a program that lay legal advocates help us walk women through the court system. And I think Mayo right now has a client who's working with us, and we're really just there for support. But through all of those mechanisms, people begin to learn what we do, and they may pick up the phone and call us. The other piece is, I think it's important to have people that work on your staff that are representative of the community, because then you have a connection and you have a potential bond. So if you're a Spanish speaker, monolingual Spanish speaker, you would want someone who you could identify with. So that's really important in terms of our outreach and education and how we connect with the community.
What reasons do you find that there's more and more abuse? Is it economically, or because it's poor communications, or drugs, or alcohol? Is there any particular thing that pops out as you as a identifier of an abused person, or reasons for abuse?
I think because people can do it.
People can do it.
I think that there is a sense that I can do this. When I engage in, when I say when a perpetrator engages in domestic abuse, and when we talk about what domestic violence is, it is really the attempt of one member or person in a relationship that attempts to intimidate, persuade, coerce, threaten through emotional and or physical abuse to do what that person wants them to do. So it takes many forms, but when I look at it in its purest form, I believe that domestic violence, domestic abuse, intimate partner violence, whatever you call it, happens because people can do it, because they can. And when you kind of do an analogy between a person who is emotionally abusive or physically abusive to their partner, I mean, they do that in the privacy of their home. A abuser, think about this, would never go into their office and punch their boss or call their boss fat, ugly. You know, you'll never. Those kinds of things don't happen. So I think there's the socialized. You know, in many ways, the society accepts the behavior that is horrific and terrible, and we have to really begin to change the way in which our society views violence against women. And I think one of the things that we're partnering on right now in the next year, the African American Men of Westchester, is to really try to look at the fundamental relationships between men and women in the African American community and really try to create a call to action to change the social attitudes that have been allowed to exist for so long. And what I'm talking about is a conference that we're putting together, and we're hopeful that we'll be able to have this in October of 2010.
Okay, the other side of it is, if you're saying that domestic violence occurs because he can do it or she can do it, then what about the other side? Why that other victim allows them to do that?
Great question. I mean, there are many reasons why women engage and stay in domestic abuse situations. And I know for African American women, and for many women, you know, it just isn't for African American women, it is the threat of losing their children. The intimidation and the coercion that I talked about, where there's a shift in the power in the relationship, is I will do this if you don't. So it may mean that you won't get money to feed your family. You may not be allowed to work. You may not be allowed to get your education. You may not be able to do many of the things that independent, economically secure women are able to do, because you have this person who has assumed control, total control, over what you do. And so the analysis, and I think it's a great question that you asked, that people don't always understand, is why does she stay? That's the question that people ask. And really the question is, why doesn't he stop? I go back to that, because there are women that I have seen over many, many years who have said to me, if I don't do this, he will go to my home in Guatemala and kill my husband, kill my mother and my family. He knows where my family and my children, because often women are here in this country and their children and other, you know, family members are not here. So there's a threat. If she's married to him and she's not legally in the country and she's undocumented, well, she will stay put, because she thinks that if she says something that she'll be arrested and that she'll be deported, and that's the threat. That holds her tight. If I'm afraid that I will be deported, or my child will be taken from me, or I'm going to be deported, my child's going to stay here, I'm not going to move. Economic independence, all of those reasons are reasons why, and those threats are very, very real to women who've experienced them over and over and over.
All right, well, we're going to go on to the counselor here and talk about defense. You know, what can a person do if they are a danger from their boyfriend or spouse? You know, the protection order, is that a vehicle, or will you talk more about that?
Yes, you can get an order of protection, but I did want to just address just a few of the things that Karen had discussed. And I tend to think that we are an aggressive and society that tends to enjoy violence, whether it's watching boxing or watching different television shows. We basically glorify violence. And the difference between, because I've had occasion to observe people in the workplace who've been abusive to their coworkers, who've said things that certainly are not tolerable to coworkers. The difference is you don't live with that person. And when you come home, a domestic violence incident that may be similar is that much greater, because you're living with this person. You can't leave. You can't ask for this person to be terminated. You don't bring a lawsuit based upon the harassment that you're receiving. And the other thing that I would only mention is that I believe that the statistics are subject to many different interpretations. Statistics can mean anything, and quite often statistics simply mean that there's a greater awareness, that perhaps law enforcement's identifying something that was already happening more than they did in the past. I used to be the chair of, well, not the chair, the chief of the bias crime unit for the district attorney's office. And there was always an issue about identifying hate crimes. So for instance, you would quite often, you could look at Alabama and they may say that in a given year there were no hate crimes. Well, that simply meant that no hate crimes had been reported. But domestic violence and violence period, in my estimation, increases in hard economic times. Now, if you are a victim of domestic violence, the court will give you an order of protection, which states quite often that the person certainly cannot harass, annoy, or alarm you. You cannot be threatened by the person who is the alleged perpetrator, and they can't have someone contact you on their behalf to threaten you or to intimidate you. The other thing that happens quite often is that there'll be a stay-away provision in that order of protection, which means that that person can no longer live with you. And as we stated earlier, these are among the most complex cases that you're ever going to have, because these cases originate sometimes based upon things that are 100% outside of the criminal court. It may occur because there's a boyfriend and a girlfriend relationship, and that relationship's coming to an end. These cases require a tremendous amount of investigation. Sometimes there's a divorce that's pending, and both parties may have a motive to give false testimony or to have a desired result based on an order of protection, which quite often, I'm sure, is necessary, but also which is equally possibly used as a sword. Mm-hmm. So for instance, if you know that you have an order of protection, then you can use that to shift the balance of power away from perhaps a spouse, a husband or wife who may earn more money than you do and who may otherwise have the power in that household. So those are some of the things that happen. And also, once you call the police will arrive, and the police quite often will believe that if they arrive at a call for a domestic violence that they have to make an arrest, which is not actually the case. They're mandated to make an arrest where they've observed a domestic violence incident. And we use the term violence somewhat freely because it doesn't necessarily mean that you ever touched that person. So a domestic violence incident can arise from someone making a telephone call to a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And it's not limited just to boyfriend-girlfriend relationships, husband-wife relationships, or same-sex relationships. It can also be within a family, for instance. You may have two brothers who don't get along for whatever reason and may harm each other, or maybe a parent and a child. But once you make that allegation, the order of protection quite often will require you to find someplace else to live. So these are considerations that we should have before we call the police. Certainly there are situations where the first call should be to the police because obviously it's a dangerous situation. There's a real threat of force even if you haven't been harmed. However, if it's simply an argument and you have been irritated and you say to yourself, you're not going to be irritated by this person anymore, there are better ways to address it. And the other thing that I would like to just mention is that My Sister's Place, as great as it is, has limited resources. So they cannot address more than a few people at a time, I believe. But it's certainly a limited number, only a few dozen, if I'm correct, at any given time. So if someone is making allegations that are perhaps either frivolous or else something that's a result of an argument as opposed to actually domestic violence, it's now taking the place of a person who truly is in need of their services.
And I think that Mayo is talking about our residential shelter.
Absolutely.
Right, because we certainly have a larger capacity, but we assess those cases as they come in.
Yeah, what's the, how do you select one who's worthy or needy of a shelter and one who you may turn away? Is ever the case?
Well, yeah, because we have, as I think Mayo appropriately stated, we have limited resources. We have 33 beds between our 2 residential shelters that are in confidential places. And so it's a finite number. So we may be full. We may be full. What we do when that call comes in on the hotline, we try to assess from the caller, what is it that you need? And often people will say that they want housing, residential shelter, but as Mayo, I think, pointed out, there are many considerations. It's very complicated and complex about who does what. So when we give people options and they really understand, oh, I have to leave my family, I won't have access to my mother for babysitting, you know, I'm not sure that's what I want to do, but what we try to do is to give people counsel. And we will, you know, if someone's not ready, you don't want someone to try to, if we do have room and they're not ready to really take in the services, we try to support them through counseling until they're able to do that.
Okay. You mentioned the protection order, order of protection.
Yes.
One thing is, I'd like to explain to our audience, is many times you would have an order of protection, and the victim will live in the home, and they will put the abuser out. But some point in time, whether it's husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend, they may get back together again. Now, how does that invalidate that order of protection, or what they have to do there?
It does not. In order to change that order of protection, you actually need the court to vacate that order or to modify that order of protection. And in fact, on occasions, there are, for instance, on a burglary, there can be a case where a building is broken into, and the person who receives the order of protection may not even know the perpetrator or the suspect, and they have an order of protection and they don't know why they have it, and but for the order of protection, the person might not even know who they are. We've had instances where those people have said, I don't need an order of protection and I don't want one, and the court has said on its own that it's going to maintain that order of protection in any event. The other thing is, we represent clients who have documented to us via videotape that the alleged complainant, the person that the district attorney's office says is the victim, has come to their home, even though they have the order of protection.
What happens is that violation of
Well,
order
technically,
of protection, and what happens then?
you don't have a duty to retreat from your own home, but it's very unadvisable for you to invite that person into your home. In fact, generally I suggest at that point in time that they try to document it. If they have witnesses, that they document it, and perhaps they should be the ones calling the police to state that this person is at my home. Because the reality is, if they're in contact any place else and that person decides that they want to call the police, you will now be in the position of being possibly charged with criminal contempt,
Right.
Either as a misdemeanor or a
That's why I want
felony.
to know the consequences.
And those consequences are tremendous. So where you may have had an argument that does not involve any physical violence whatsoever with a person who's close to you, and you may decide that you want to resolve that matter outside of the court, and even then you need the approval of the district attorney's office generally to do that. If there's a criminal contempt charge for you violating that court's order, the court will take that extremely seriously, and that court and the district attorney's office can proceed on their own, simply based on a witness other than the quote-unquote victim. And if you're ever arrested down the road for anything, and an arrest is only that, it doesn't mean you've done anything wrong. It simply means that somebody believes you did. You may later be fully exonerated. They may realize that you are not that person. Okay. It doesn't matter, because this court will now have an order of protection that you have violated, and they'll consider that when it's time to set bail. So you can actually be remanded to a correctional facility because of that.
Okay. Mr. Lomax, I want to ask you that new legislation, what new legislations or what type of bills are coming down, has been passed recently to give more security and to the domestic violence victims?
Well, I think just overall, I think there has been an attempt by the state legislature, the Assembly, and the Senate to really look at, from a practical standpoint, what are the needs from a legislative standpoint that domestic violence victims have. And there's been a host of new legislation. One that just happened recently was the governor signed legislation. It was an omnibus domestic violence bill that really addressed a number of needs throughout communities. For example, in this most recent bill, there was a call for training for law guardians on domestic violence issues And law guardians, as you probably know, represent children in custody, visitation, and even in some of the order of protection cases. So without having a trained expert or a trained advocate, some of the decision making, I think some of the advocacy wasn't where it needed to be, supporting the big picture of domestic violence. And so I think that Senator Klein just recently passed legislation in the Senate where he is, and he's looking for, I believe he has a sponsor in the Assembly, where insurance companies now have to give domestic violence victims the ability to give an alternative address if they are in fact victims of domestic violence. And why is that? Because the policy may be the policy that the perpetrator has taken out, and if she has to give her current whereabouts, if it's a safe house, that's going to be problematic.
Okay, look like we're running out of time. Very shortly, maybe a minute apiece. Could you kind of sum up or leave, what would you like to leave with our audience about domestic violence from your side of the
I would say that it's complicated. It's not something that's easily comprehensible. People ask the question, why doesn't she stay? We talked earlier before the cameras came on, what did Brianna, the young woman who was clearly battered by Chris Brown, what did she do to cause that? The question really should be, why did he do what he did? And I think we have to stop victim blaming, and we really have to educate ourselves around what this issue is, and how do we begin to, as communities, change the conduct and behavior.
I would agree with Karen. I think that it's crystal clear that that's what's necessary. Also, as we become more aware of some of the complexities, the legislature is actually taking good steps to ensure that people who are victims of domestic violence do have an opportunity to receive benefits. For instance, if you're receiving Medicaid, you may be receiving it in one jurisdiction where you could not receive it someplace else.
Right.
The shelter may be in that town where you would
Right.
not be eligible. But the other thing, again, that I would stress perhaps most is that it's important that we train our law enforcement as prosecutors as well as police officers to make sure that there's a thorough investigation. And that probably in these cases, as much as any other case, is required. And by doing that, and coupled with education, and I think, again, organizations such as My Sister's Place going into the schools would be a great benefit.
Okay, well, thank you for coming and sharing your views with us. Thank you for watching the program. I just want to just leave us with one thing here is domestic violence in New York increased 7.3% last year to 147 cases, while the number of murders overall rose 2.6%. So we're looking for an increase here. Our panel here explained it beautifully. And I just want to say, if you need some help to reach out to My Sister's Place, which is a leader and resource in the field of domestic violence and advocacy, shelter, and legal services. And their number is 914-683-1333. 914-683-1333, My Sister's Place. And I've been your host, Melvin Burris. Our guest has been Mayo Bartlett, Esquire, defense attorney, and Karen Cheek Lomax, Esquire, director of My Sister Place. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching. Peace and God bless.